Hi, Tina.
So, okay. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Balongibog Talks COVID-19 segment. So we started it actually for the past 3 weeks, and we're now on the third week. Today, this is the uh, fourth lecture of the week. Um, we have Dr. John A. Peterson, professor of the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History of the University of San Carlos. And also, he's the president of International Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management of ICOMOS. So, I'm sorry, I'm cutting the introduction because of some, maybe I don't know if my internet is good. So, Dr. Peterson?
Okay, thank you. The title of this obviously is a pun on Love in the Time of Cholera, the great novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I read it half a century ago myself, but this story is basically about a young couple who are in love, but her father won't let them marry, so he makes them separate, and in time, the young woman marries another man, a doctor, who's interestingly enough, very much of an advocate of modern Western science and progress and order. But famously, after 51 years, 9 months and 4 days, and after the death of the doctor, the couple get together again, and this is a victory for love after these many decades. So, sitting inside in Cebu during the coronavirus quarantine, when seniors and children are required to stay inside 24 hours a day, I've had a lot of time to think about my profession and my eagerness to get back into the heritage world one way or another. Of course, fantasies abound about going to places like Mount Fuji, obviously a very significant and sacred World Heritage Site in Japan, but we don't know what the future holds in terms of travel. It might be a while before we can even get to some of these fabulous sites. I've spent some time in various parts of Fuji, and it's very inspirational to me. But then we also have our own regional environment here in the Philippines, and some areas that are quite wild and some areas that are actually even on the tentative list for World Heritage. But if not, at least they're recognized as very significant natural and cultural areas within the Philippines. And a lot of communities hold them dear, and a lot of communities are beginning to sort of engage in their own heritage, both natural and physical. And there's great hope that many more of these places can be preserved. And I'm going to advocate here, actually, after this presentation, or during this presentation, that promoting this kind of regional and local heritage may be some of the best work we can do as soon as we're able to regain our our commitment to heritage preservation. The whole world, of course, is eager to get back to work or play, and this scene, which purportedly was taken in one of the California beaches a few days ago, although it seems to be controversial. But anyway, it shows how eager people are to get back. And one of the concerns we almost have about heritage preservation and environmental conservation is that once this surge for reopening begins, we may see businesses, developers, developments trying to catch up lost time, and we may need to be even more vigilant about trying to protect areas. And of course, our behavior will probably be changing as we get back into the world. For example, social distancing, something that's going to have to be practiced probably for quite a while, according to the more reliable public health announcements and so forth. There have been some benefits. Clean air. This is Los Angeles, taken just a couple of weeks ago. People outside walking with plenty of social distancing from others. But in a way, this kind of masks another issue that I'd like to mention and discuss a bit as well. And that is that climate change, of course, was creating enormous problems for some areas. But for LA, for example, the clean air makes us sort of forget about it briefly. And it makes it look as though, well, maybe there's been some success in abating carbon dioxide emissions and so forth. My daughter Marina sent me a great article the other day documenting a 5.5% drop in CO2 emissions and 20% lower global travel, but 28% lower US travel being largely responsible for that. Wonderful if we could keep these gains going, but we still need to go at least 7.6% lower to meet the 1.5-degree temperature cap goal. And in fact, counterintuitively, clear skies may actually increase global warming because of the greater insolation that pollution sometimes blocks that, just like volcanism does in other contexts. Everybody's ready to get back to work. The skies will probably change. They'll probably become grimmer pretty soon. Business is booming. Business is expecting to boom, I should say. And advertisers are catching on to that. One toilet paper company saying, we're in this together. Together we'll keep America rolling. Clothing designers are urging people to be Zoom ready with fashion statements. And one company selling a brass keychain tool for $35 to touch elevators and other buttons is taking advantage of our changing behavior. But, you know, the adaptation, the change will be slow, and we need to get ready for those slow changes, but also for the long run. So small steps forward. What I want to propose in this presentation is that World Heritage, of course, is a wonderful global program of UNESCO. It's had its problems. I'll discuss some of those, but it's changing. And I think we need to think about how we can, and through our practice, can help that change to include local and regional efforts, local and regional representation, developing nations instead of the global north, as Boboy calls it. To look at how we can be engaged with communities, community engagement, and empowering communities to enhance social justice, but also to enhance environmental justice. One of the initiatives of ICOMOS, which is an organization in support of the World Heritage Committee, and ICOM, my scientific committee, is a committee in support of ICOMOS. And one of the things that ICOMOS is promoting, along with the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation Networks, is a nature culture journey. So we begin to think of heritage as a combined thing, not just cultural heritage and cultural heritage practitioners, and not just environmentalists, but it is in fact one embracing concept. World Heritage in the beginning, in the 1970s, was obviously promoting some of the well-known sites around the first world, the developed world, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Giza pyramids, obvious kind of no-brainers to put on the list. But the World Heritage Organization and the committee has struggled from the beginning, and in the last 20 years especially, but even a bit before that, has been trying to broaden their mission and trying to draw in developing nations and others. Also, the concept of what constitutes outstanding universal value and what constitutes what is known as authenticity, or the condition of a site, or the character of a site that contributes to those outstanding universal values, was embraced in something called the Nara Doctrine as early as 1994. And this was a significant doctrine for some of the things I'm going to mention, because it includes intangible culture and continuing cultural practice in the designation of World Heritage Sites, but also in the way they can be managed, and the way, and the way communities can produce heritage management plans for them. The World Heritage Committee has tried to broaden participation. I think there are nominations every year to the committee and also to committees within ICOMOS, but more and more there are people from other parts of the world than the global north. The Arab states are nominating a member to the committee, and more we'll see that. And that's very important, because sometimes things that the committee adopts in this day compared to 40 years ago are quite different and radical, would have been radical to people then. mention one of those examples in this presentation. ICOMOS is promoting sustainable development goals. And this is ironic because tourism is almost always included, some form of tourism. But I think we're seriously going to see tourism challenged. And especially if we embrace climate change or global warming goals at the same time that we do overall heritage preservation goals, because of the impacts on carbon dioxide emissions, but also the impacts on archaeological sites. There have been enormous problems with sites that have been abused, have been overused. In Palau, in the last year or so, the president, Remengosau, limited the numbers of flights coming from People's Republic of China because there were too many. Because of China's booming economy, people were coming in droves, and they cut the flights from 12 to 3 a week. That cut into the revenue significantly because one of the keys to financial sustainability for the Rock Islands has been an environmental green fee, and that reduced that income quite a bit. But it was a serious effort by Remengosau to maintain the condition of the Southern Rock Islands. Within World Heritage, there are other possibilities, but some at the edge of World Heritage inscriptions. World Heritage nominations are now very expensive to undertake. The original ones were maybe no more than a page or so. The Giza pyramids, you could read it in a few minutes. Now they're very lengthy documents with enormous supportive documentation, and they have been difficult for developing nations to promote and produce, partly because of the standards have really changed, have really been raised. But anyway, there are other things people can do. And within World Heritage, there are ways to make the process a bit more efficient. So regional inscriptions and transboundary inscriptions, which means countries getting together to promote a theme across the boundaries. For example, Palau and Yap in the Federated States of Micronesia have been working on a transboundary nomination on the stone money of Yap, which is quarried in Palau. There was a transboundary and regional inscription of the European stilt house villages in several countries in Europe on the high lakes, on the alpine lakes or montane lakes. Hundreds of sites were involved in that, and there are others around the world. These might be keys and also things that the Philippines might consider as efficient ways, effective but efficient ways of promoting sites to World Heritage if that's what's deemed appropriate. Serial inscriptions in the Philippines could include the volcanic parks. The IUCN and the environmental agencies responsible for the World Heritage tentative list in the Philippines listed about 4 volcanic areas, Mayon being one of those, which is pictured here. 5, I guess, including that. And I'll talk to this, but there was a recent nomination for Mayon that was not successful, and I'll go into that a bit. But in the meantime, Mayon and some of those other volcanic parks might be very effectively nominated as a serial inscription for high biodiversity areas, but also the natural and cultural value of the parks, or of the sites. And UNESCO geoparks, another area that really could be promoted for the Philippines. It's a lot less of an undertaking to do a nomination for the geoparks. It's operated by UNESCO. It involves geological features, but also the cultural and other components of large landscapes. Bohol was involved. There was a nomination being prepared for Bohol as recently as last year, but it's still not on the evaluation list for the UNESCO geoparks. I'm not sure, maybe Tina or others will know what the fate of that is, but it's something we could promote for a lot of areas, especially areas that we're doing community mapping work in, like I'll show a bit later in this presentation. So Mount Mayon, a nomination was prepared, a dossier was prepared to include this. It's on the tentative list for the World Heritage sites from the Philippines. It was proposed as a natural scenic area and that was the major criteria that was used. And as I've heard this mostly secondhand, but it was returned with a request that that be broadened to include cultural aspects of the mountain. And it's here perched at the edge of Legazpi, a big urban development, but there's a lot of area with high biodiversity within Mayon itself. And there are possible connections to indigenous peoples like Negrito, who have residents on a mountain just to the north. I think it's north or west of Mayon. And around Mayon, there's a rich history of early Bicolanos, but also the Spanish who came in the 16th century, and a number of Spanish churches and missions and communities that built up around those. So there are some prospects for that, and that could be the site of a really comprehensive cultural mapping or community mapping project, and hopefully that can be done. Students at Partido State University will likely want to be involved. Students at Bicol State University will want to be involved, and there are faculty in both those places that have expressed interest in this. Brian Griffin and I went there to Bicol State University, and Boboy has a project with Earl John and others in Partido State. So that could be a huge area of collaboration to promote that nomination. Another area on the tentative list that is very deserving of being brought forth, and I bring this up partly because it shows what more research can do for some of these areas, and this is, in this case, LIDAR, available from LIPAD, which has been used on maps with the locations of the 9 Butuan boats, or 10 now, I think, that were buried in one of the river channels of the Agusan del Sur River. And you can see here also a lot of other features of the landscape that could make this a very powerful tool for helping to organize that as a nomination. The light blue areas right next to the little diamonds are over 2.5 meters high. These could have been areas of village settlement near where the boats were probably birthed when some natural disaster or series of disasters may have buried them almost simultaneously. The dates overlap, and it could have been a simultaneous event. But anyway, in order to look at it as a whole landscape, one really should be looking at the village settlements. And we can see here areas from this LIDAR mapping that would enable us to do that. And also, if you go to the back of the valley, there's another element of this whole landscape, which is a high sea stand of almost 2 meters, 3,000 to 6,000 years ago throughout tropical regions of the world. And that actually created an escarpment at the back. At the base of the escarpment, it was an area where shell middens have accumulated. And there are some very significant sites, shell midden sites, dating back to that period. So that may have been an area where the high sea stand was. This whole flat alluvium might therefore have been, sea. And even 1,000 years ago, the dark blue areas show very nicely, and even the black areas where 1 meter higher sea stand, which some geologists are proposing 1,000 years ago. So in other words, it dropped from 2 down to present, and then rose again to 1, and then now it's dropped again. And that higher 1 meter higher sea level could have made this very, very close to the seashore, or right at the very mouth of the river. So a lot of interesting things to propose. But the National Museum has been buying land to preserve these areas where the boats might be found. And Fritz Luth with the German Archaeological Institute has said he'd be receptive to an invitation to bring his prospection equipment, ER and ground penetrating radar, to Butuan to work to find possibly more boats, but also to define a core and buffer area for such a nomination. So there's a lot of possibilities. This is what the boats look like when they're first found. This one, I think, is still in place. It's covered with water. This was dewatered for the day so we could see it. So those are some areas where World Heritage itself could move forward. And after this respite from involvement with the big meetings and travel and everything else, there's time to think about those things and maybe talk about them and see how those could move forward. But in the meantime, there's another element of heritage preservation in the Philippines, or anywhere in the world for that matter, but in the Philippines, which is being conducted now, looking at local heritage, trying to find ways to empower communities and engage with communities. An excellent example of this is Stephen Akabato's Ifugao project, and with Marlon Martin, where SITMO has taken charge to empower the Ifugao area. They're listed as a World Heritage monument, but for years, everything is managed through the governors and through the national government. But now SITMO, with the help of SITMO, the local community and the regional community there have been taking a lot more charge of it. And then, of course, intangible culture, which World Heritage has accommodated and is actually a part of the Nara doctrine, but it's something that is still present in many parts of the Philippines, native, very long-lasting indigenous cultures. The National Committee of Indigenous Peoples manages some of the domains, but there are peoples that still have active cultural practices. And so anyway, as heritage practitioners, there are a couple of ways we can engage in this, I think, through community mapping that I'll show you in a minute. And also through what IUCN and ICOMOS have promoted as the nature culture journey, beginning in 2016 at the Honolulu IUCN annual meeting. There was a major push to get everybody thinking about how a heritage place is not just cultural, it's not just natural, but it's really important to look at how those two aspects of heritage overlap and integrate. Now, a place where there has been sort of a bit of a conflict with the international agenda of ICOMOS and World Heritage Committee, in contrast with the local and regional and indigenous ownership and management of a community, is in Namadol in, you have to sit.
Hey, Daddy, what?
Shh, we're on TV. Excuse me. Namadol in the Western Pacific in the Federated States of Micronesia, which was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2016, but at the same time, it was placed on the endangered sites list, and was basically told you need to deal with some serious problems, or you can be delisted from the list. So this was the first time it had ever happened. The committee felt it was very important to include Namadol for a number of reasons, but also that they needed to be put on notice to correct these things immediately. It's a large, for those that don't know, it's a large many hectare site with basalt stone architecture on islets, temples and residences built on islets in the middle of a set of lagoons or canals. And this was done about 1,000 years ago by a people called the Saudalur, recognized by in Pohnpeians today. And the site was active and actively used for a few hundred years, but then fell into disuse, and in fact was probably abandoned when a culture hero named Isarog basically freed the rest of the peoples of the region from what had been interpreted as an evil empire. The Saudalur were coercive and controlling of the population, and Isarog was looked upon as a cultural hero. This is Nandawas, one of the principal islets, which was possibly the major ceremonial center. And you can see these basaltic, prismatic basaltic rocks that were laid in place for the architecture and built around these canals. This is Pancatel, which is probably one of the earliest sites, and it's renowned for not only being one of the earliest, but also because one of the first archaeologists that came to work in Namadol removed or excavated the burial of one of the first rulers, and it didn't fare well for him. He died of what was thought of to be a heart attack within a few days. And there have been other mysterious sorts of things. Hambrook, Jan Hambrook, for example, who took a number of artifacts decades later, was involved in a travel to Marshall Islands. And a storm came up, sank the boats, and all of the items that he was intending to take back to Europe were cast into the bottom of the sea. So local people have a sense of foreboding, in fact, about Micronesia, excuse me, about Nan-Madol, and probably Micronesia too, but Nan-Madol, mainly because of this sense of evil, the history of the Saudeleur being a coercive people, and actually they weren't big on the idea of preserving the island, the islets, because of this sense of evil, and they didn't often visit it. Only very rarely would people visit it. We'll talk about that. But this is Namdauis from the air, and here you can see how it's surrounded by the canals. And this is showing the seaside with a significant set of 3 different breakwaters, plus it's within the coral reef fringing, barrier reef, and that lagoon itself also protects from storms. Now, what the World Heritage Committee was arguing was that the canals are silting in. There's risk to the monument from some of these stones being out of place in the seawalls, and also that there's some degradation of some of the walls that are collapsing in various places. And basically the World Heritage Commission and ICOMOS was saying you really need to correct those 3 problems. And then governance and also interpretation were thought of as 2 areas that needed work in order to be removed from the endangered list. Anyway, there has been quite a bit of effort in the last couple of years looking at some of these things. And the first recommendations by ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee were very extreme. Basically that cranes should be taken in to lift the stones into place, and dredging equipment should be placed in these canals to dredge the sands out. But those seem to be really extreme measures, and it wasn't well received by Pohnpeians who didn't really feel like that would be an appropriate way to treat the monument. It was placed on the World Heritage after overcoming some resistance from other Pohnpeians who had this sense of dread, but it was because it was felt it would be an important recognition of culture in Micronesia. And anyway, there has been an effort to try to look at less invasive ways of doing this conservation. If you look at this aerial, Nan-Madol is by that little bay. It's basically right in the middle, on the edge of Temwan Island. But you look at the brown off inside that Madrilenum Harbor, that's all silt that's been basically stopped in its circulation. That's the silt that we argue now, after some study, is, and by local hydrologists in Pohnpei, a hydrogeologist named Bradley Phillips, for one, who's a Pohnpeian. Basically, he argues that because of restrictions, and you can see it better on this picture, off to the left you see a causeway crossing from the mainland to Temwan Island. The causeway has only 2 openings in it, and you can see the silt backing up behind it. According to Bradley, the circulation should be clockwise, and if that's blocked, it actually stops, the circulation stops, and it stops the clearing of silt from these canals. We think that model is more appropriate by simply replacing the causeway with possibly an open span structure, or at least breaking more culverts into it. That problem may be resolved without the need to bring dredging equipment in. Also, another archaeologist, Christoph Sand, did some coring and found that there's intact archaeology in layers in the canals. So dredging could be really disruptive and intrusive. So that's one area that can be settled, I think, without having the need for intrusive equipment. The breakwaters themselves are in very good condition. And in fact, the engineering of that 1,000 years ago by the Saudeleur was incredibly sophisticated. Army Corps of Engineers who came to look at the breakwaters indicated that they're built much like the modern breakwaters with the tetrapods, the giant concrete tetrapods, meant to stop surging sea, but allowing it to flow back out immediately afterward, was basically the effect of the open construction of these breakwaters that the Saudeleur engineered. So actually, here again, sea level may have been a meter higher 1,000 years ago, just as it may have been in Butuan, it probably was. But looking at the fact it was built already to resist what is now probably a few decades or maybe several decades into the future, that may be an unnecessary modification. Anyway, the third area then is in the reconstruction or rehabilitation of collapsed segments. And here's where ritual and intangible culture is extremely important in the indigenous heritage management of Namadol. There is a whole ritual and chants even for the various stone construction in other projects around Pohnpei today. The gathering of lagoonal gravels that are used as fill in the hollow structure of the basalt rock. And every step of it actually is very significantly controlled by ritual and chants and dance, as you can see in this picture of dance on some of the pavilions and other areas of Pohnpei today. So Rufino Mauricio, who's a PhD archaeologist who studied at the University of Oregon, is now the director of the National Archives for what is called for Culture and History. And he's very keen that heavy equipment isn't needed. In fact, the original Pohnpeians constructed these without cranes 1,000 years ago, but that appropriate ritual must be needed. All these things were included in a reactive mission report that Ian Lilly and Christoph Sand and Peter Cox and some others did almost a year ago now, January of 2019. They submitted this to the World Heritage Center, and the commission voted and accepted the report, with some urging, on the other hand, from ICOMOS apparently, that they revise the report to still include those mechanical remedies. But in this case, the reactive mission agreed with the indigenous approaches of Pohnpei, and it was accepted by the World Heritage Committee, which one reason for that may be their broader constituency now among developing nations. Okay, another area where I think we can make significant progress in cultural heritage envisioning in the Philippines is in areas where LGUs, local government units, are committed to recording their local heritage. And at the University of San Carlos, where I'm a faculty in the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History, the chair, Lila Labajo, and then also another faculty member, Jobers Rosales, have been working on a couple of different community and cultural mapping programs. With Jobers, it's working with the government and the governor of Cebu, Gwen Garcia, and with Lila, it's been working with individual communities, local government units in the provinces, and I've been able to join her on several of these. And one very important one that I think we'll be doing a field school on within the next foreseeable future, hopefully at the end of this whole quarantining, is in Burawan in the center. Now, this is all empowered by a national law passed in 2009, I believe, or at least the implementations followed soon after. And one of the many, this is actually where the World Heritage, responsibilities for World Heritage and other programs is described in this law, actually with a combination of federal agencies, National Commission on Culture and the Arts, National Historical Commission, and the National Museum being the main leaders in that. But they also require local government units through their cultural offices to maintain an inventory of cultural property under its jurisdiction and to furnish the commission, which is the NCCA managed commission, a copy of the same. Well, this is a huge resource for community histories and heritage management. I think Jojo Abenalis will be delighted if he ever can see hundreds or thousands of these documents coming into the NCCA with documentation of local history from all over the Philippines. It'll be a phenomenal accomplishment. But in the meantime, requiring the LGUs to do this means they would have to fund something locally. And the LGUs have been supporting our college, our university graduate students and small teams to go out to do the cultural mapping. And we've worked already in Camotes and Burawan and Bohol, and in we were about to go to Siquijor and would have been there on April 28th or March 28th when the island was shut off to all outside access. And we'd still be there, but that might have been quite nice. Anyway, we'll be going to Sikihor sometime, whenever this lifts. Around Buarawan are a number of communities that I'll share with you. We've already been able to make some progress on finding heritage places. But one of them in Via Humada, which is a village, a sitio not far from Buarawan, but higher in the mountains, in its main plaza, uses this, this steel sheet as their Balongibog. I thought that was really appropriate for this series of talks. They hit this with a mallet before any kind of village activities in the plaza, before meetings and so forth. And it's the bell calling everyone to the plaza in Via Humada. In Via Humada, there were several archaeological sites that I'll show you that we were told about by the community. And basically the barangay captain, working with the mayor of Buarawan, of the major city in the region, major municipality in the region, had already organized the community to try to locate and describe and lead us to sites that could be included in this cultural inventory. As an archaeologist and a Western archaeologist at that, even though I've worked here for 20 years and I've learned a huge amount from the experience, but we still have our Western templates, and this kind of mapping is one example of that. But it's something that can be shared with communities to help find sites that they might find a value, that they may already find a value, or they might think about contextualizing as part of their heritage. This is the late Pleistocene, full glacial period Sunda land map. The light green was actually above water 20,000 years ago. And if you see the connection between Indonesia to the south through Greater Sulu, through Mindanao, north into Leyte, and from there with very, very, very modest and narrow water gaps from there up into Greater Luzon. We now know that there are quite old paleofauna and maybe even human occupation at the same time. The Kalinga rhino in very northern Cagayan Valley, and work in the Callao Cave has documented quite old remains. I think they were in the middle of a season this year to find more, but probably had to abandon that. But you can see the possibilities of even more of these sites throughout the region. In fact, a few years ago, we worked in Mactan Island at the Plantation Bay Resort on an underwater cave 40 meters below the surface that would have been above the water during this period. And during this period, we thought there was a chance it could be occupied by people. And in our expedition, we so far have mainly been able to just describe the deposits, but we need a full-on effort to go back with equipment to really explore the deposit. We got down to date the deposits that we dated to about 3,500 years ago, but we need to go another 15 or 16,000 years to find what might have been human use. At the same time, we were able to document the formation period of a coral reef that the cave formed in about 126,000 years ago, and of the cave itself, which was then above water by 91,000 years ago, and then briefly was submerged and then emergent, briefly was emergent, and then was submerged again, and is of course now 40 meters below the surface. The people in Maragondon at the time were astonished. They said, "Well, what are you saying? People were frogmen then? How could they possibly have lived underwater?" And we would drag out these maps to try to explain why we thought they might have been occupied much earlier. There's a whole series of about 6 of these different caves at that same elevation along the whole straits that Andrea Halandoni and I dived on a couple of others, and there's a huge opportunity there to be looking at paleo fauna and possible paleo human settlement in the region 50,000 years ago, but also maybe even much longer. Now, this map was made by a dedicated Bellwoodian and out of Taiwan adherent. Ignore that part for now. We'll talk about that some other time. But it's an excellent map that Mike Carson prepared to show the peopling of the Pacific in what has been called one of the greatest migration processes in human history. You'll see that Kosrae and Ponape were settled around 200 years ago from the Solomon Islands. The Wapita cultures around 1500 to 1300 years ago in the Bismarck Archipelago. Palau possibly earlier from the Philippines, but the Philippines, we think, many of us think that it was more a northward movement of people throughout the Philippines, not a out of Taiwan movement, but it amounts to about the same thing. Ultimately, there was as Roger Blench calls it, a boiling pot of people in the region that were speaking Malayo-Polynesian languages and then eventually sailed out into the Pacific. Those are our Western maps. In Burawan, we'll be looking for those kinds of processes, like sites from those periods of migration. In the meantime, what we've found so far is quite impressive, and it has been because of local farmers in the Burawan area, and also local looters or collectors. This gentleman's father had been collecting from sites for the last 50 years. Some of the sites that we saw had actually been first reported to him, and he went in with the villagers that hired the farmers to dig these. These are mostly, some of them are, they're all Ming or later. I think there's one or two that might be a bit earlier. But anyway, it really clearly shows the movement of peoples and goods through the region as long ago as 800 years ago, maybe certainly by 600 or 700 years ago during the Ming. And these, of course, is the great value that the villagers and the collectors were looking for early on. This is a site, this is one of the sites that these items came from. And it's actually, we call it, it's in the barangay of Ilihan. It's above the river. And on this site, there actually is a deeper occupation of probably Neolithic era peoples, shown by the adzes and blade tools at the top of this. Now, all of these things were excavated by the farmers when they were looking for the Asian pottery, Asian export pottery, and they kept it. The collector wasn't interested, but they kept it for themselves and showed it to us. We don't know the stratigraphy, the provenience of these items, but we want to do a field school there, and the community is greatly supportive of this. The LGU will provide funding, maybe on their own behalf, an unspecified amount for logistics, but another $500,000 to mobilize a field school for students and others in the region. And I think we'll be able to possibly peel back layers in this site to, hopefully, to the Neolithic period, which might have been peoples involved in that migratory pattern along the coast. Another thing deeply important to Filipinos is their Catholic heritage. Of course, it was part of the great global North expansion, Spanish movements around the world. But here you can see the remains of something that some in the community had called, some of the people living in this barrio, this sitio, were saying they thought was the first church in Burawan, but everyone else thought the first church was actually a structure built in the 19th century on the town square, which was not one of the old Spanish Baroque churches like are in many communities. The Jesuits first came into this area of Leyte, and their major site was in Haro to the north, but they operated visitas out of Haro, monthly one-day masses conducted by the priests throughout the area. And these visitas were mostly very rude structures, but they then slowly led to the establishment of actual parishes in the other communities. And this visita at Burawan was remarked earlier during the Jesuit era, but by the time the Jesuits were dispelled and the Augustinians took over the mission work, they built a parish. And in 1804, we have a record of a parish, and description of the wall around the parish and the actual structure itself are very close to what we see in this compound in the area of several hundred yards from the present center of Burawan. We think it might be the 1804 parish. We're not really sure. It could have been even from an earlier structure, but this one, at least at the moment, looks promising to document that church history, which is extremely important to people in the area. Around Villa Humada, one of the farmers who showed us the site, the artifacts that were dug were taken out from about 1 to 2 meters below the surface. If you weren't either a farmer digging around here and there or an archaeologist maybe having some sort of access to disturbances or prospection or something, you wouldn't really think of this as an archaeological site. There's nothing on the top of the ground. But there's several areas here right outside of Villa Humada that could be very promising for digs. We're hoping that it's secure, that the area is secure. At some point, we want to go back and visit these and document them. But again, it's to expand that kind of, it's a combination of local interest, but also Western scientific interest. Another very profound historic event that occurred in this area was the invasion of Leyte, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which took place in 4 or 5 days in October 1944, called the largest naval battle in history, was all right there, right offshore from Borawan and Tacloban. And Tacloban, of course, is where MacArthur went ashore and photographed himself going ashore how many dozen times to make sure they had the right angle, but anyway, they did. And the battle raged here for many, many days, even weeks after the landings. Borawan was right in the center of it. The thing used as a Balongibog in the village square, we think was probably a armored plate behind the pilot in a fighter jet that was crashed near Borawan. And some other crashes have been documented up in Haro and some other areas around there. The armored plate was taken from a crash very near Borawan. The barangay captain said he could take us there. We may visit sometime, or maybe the DPAA affiliated recovery teams can go to that area. But that's very recent history for this area. And in fact, some CTOs that we visited along the river below Borawan out toward the sea showed us places where from major flooding, the banks had collapsed and you could see Western armaments and vehicles, even lots of stuff, Japanese and American both, from the battle. So that's very vivid in people's minds, as is the Japanese occupation from 41 to late 44. And there was in fact a Japanese base with an airfield, and that is still pretty well preserved. Some of the refuge housing and Habitat for Humanity housing after Yolanda was built in the Japanese airfield vicinity and on some of the paved areas there. Another CTO high in the mountains called Kakmana we visited, and our students were able to interview elderly women here who are actually Mamanwa people. And they came here from Surigao apparently 70 plus years ago, maybe right around the time of the war they were displaced. But they actually are in this area, which is right at the end of the road. Literally, this bridge was being built last year. But before that, the only way in was hiking. It's amazing to be in a village in the Philippines with no vehicles, no jeepneys, no cars, and really beautiful place. Around Cagabana and up in the mountains behind that are natural parks that are in the national listings for the Philippines. Mahagna volcano, it was a very important place to, we're sure to indigenous peoples, besides the Mamanwa. And there are hot springs here, and it's also an area where there's subsistence fishing and subsistence farming going on, and that's all preserved and promoted. We think in Borawan, in other words, there's the cultural inventory there is going to be very, very rich, and it's giving already what the community knows about it themselves, and with the support of a very progressive mayor and council, they're working to promote this. The area might ultimately be considered possibly eligible for geopark listing. This is the mountains up. Kagbana is back in that area somewhere. And this is the volcanic ridge up behind, which is all a natural area. There are Philippine eagles in this place. It's very high biodiversity. And right now it's not recognized on a tentative list or anything else, but it could be the kind of place that could really be promoted for preservation and would be of huge benefit to the whole, to the nation, to the world, and also to the local community. So onto a post-COVID world. We can expect more digital interaction. I finally had to learn to use Zoom, although we'll see how well I've been able to do it. Somebody yesterday showed me how to put my little background up there. Less freedom of movement and aggregation, local over global travel and commerce. I think tourism is going to have to really be, and there's going to have to be a lot of rethinking about tourism, not just because of the pollution and contributions to global warming, but also because of now the imminence of things like viral pandemics. Lila Labajo, the chair of DASH, posted this, I think, a couple of days ago to Facebook. It tells about some of the dire sides of the opening of the quarantine, and we can see already in the news that there will be plenty of people who are going to try to use that as a means to surge business and economic development, and also then therefore land development and petroleum development, but also to perhaps exercise more autocratic control. And by engaging and empowering communities, we can certainly help to resist this. But we'll have to figure out ways to do it where we aren't necessarily dependent in any region on airlines, hospitality, and tourism. Namadol, for example, Pohnpei gets 2,300 tourists a year. That's before. Now they get none. The airlines, most of the flights have been stopped. But 23 tourists a year visited Namadol. It wasn't a major economic force for Pohnpei. We may have to think about those kinds of things for even more visible and more accessible sites around the world. We're faced with the challenge to promote people, communities, and culture in the face of new realities, which include these autocratic and development binges that are being proposed and already promulgated. To think of heritage as also nature and culture, natural and cultural, environmental and cultural, but to promote it, and social justice over exploitive development, and to promote environmental justice through heritage preservation over the potential degraded environment with climate change and ongoing challenge to global sustainability. I read a poem many years ago, I think actually it was in the mid-70s, by Gary Snyder, American poet, wilderness poet, if you will. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, our valleys, pastures, we can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb the coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, and go light. So thank you all very much. That's all. Now, hey, am I still sharing my screen? Stop share. Yay! Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for that very wonderful lecture. Thank you as well for showing us heritages here in the Philippines. At least,
Is that Bailey?
okay. So I guess we can entertain questions from the panel, from our participants. Okay, so I guess some are still preparing or typing their questions. Probably we can start with I have a question, sir. Sorry for the background. The Malacanang announced that in the general community quarantine here in the Philippines.
It's okay.
So with the announcement of the general community quarantine here in the Philippines, museums are still prohibited to operate. So museums are closed for since the start of the ECQ. So were are there any like ICOMOS or heritage in the heritage sector working um on the affected museum advocates or workers like museum professionals who couldn't do their work because of the ECQ or something like that?
Well, yeah, Tina just made a posting today on the ICOMOS Facebook page about some best practices in a heritage site. I didn't get a chance to read it yet because I was working on this, but maybe Tina could talk to that. I thought, yes, there are some groups, and there's been discussion of best practices guides in other places. Since we're engaged in this international ICOMOS community, we're seeing things from other places, but it would be a great product of our group here, I think. But go ahead, sorry. Tina.
I think there's several groups. One is Nayong Filipino, who's also getting people together to try and figure that out. Ultimately, ICOMOS as a group or an NGO, there's very little power right now to institute that. What we can do is be a think tank and make suggestions to these agencies that actually have the power to distribute the budget, no? So right now, as far as ICOMOS Philippines, not yet, but that's what we put in the table, on the table, and are collectively discussions for.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving us an update, Ma'am Tina. Okay, there is a question from Dr. Acabado. How do we encourage a change in the UNESCO conservation model, sir?
Resistance. Continuing, persistent, patient resistance. I think that model of what happened in Namadol is really great, because in the Pacific Islands, people don't really, they're very resilient, but they don't really fight back openly. They avoid confrontation. They move back. They're soft. And when ICOMOS made these demands, of course, it was through Western experts, saying, yeah, you got to use the cranes, you got to do this, you kind of got to do that. But we had, fortunately, a very sympathetic reactive mission group, Ian and Peter Cox and Christoph and a couple of others. And they were able to listen very reflectively to what was being said in Pohnpei, and were able to craft that into a document that was very effective. But had it been hit head on, I'm not sure. I think there might have been a war. ICOMOS, like engineers in Europe and the US, are really adamant about these sort of scientific approaches to all this blah, blah, blah. So there might have been a war, but our committee was very successful. So it was, horizontal power, horizontal exchange without direct confrontation. So I say gentle resistance, quiet, persistent resistance. What other term? Weapons of the weak. Yes, it can be resisted and needs to be. And many of the people in ICOMOS and World Heritage Center are extremely sensitive to it, but others are still kind of old school. So there were a couple of people, I'm told by Ian Lilly, I'm told that there were a couple of people in ICOMOS that were not going to let that go to the World Heritage Committee for consideration, but they made a modest revision and got it on the agenda. Because the committee has changed, and that's been another significant difference, it was accepted. So that's a really, I think that's a really good illustration of ways that can happen. And now you told a story about Ifugao, right? So I was alarmed not too long ago. A letter came to the governor of Ifugao province from World Heritage Committee, World Heritage Center, saying that they needed to get more active in preserving the terrace, blah, 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 blah. And the fact that it went to the governor and was held several weeks or months before it was finally forwarded to SITMO, Marlon Martin, and the real community managers of the whole World Heritage site, was very unfortunate, but I think Marlon handled it very well, and the efforts by the community there have been really, really wonderful about addressing conservation needs, but also sort of dealing with that global north prejudice. What do you think, Boboy? Are you writing?
Oh.
You're not talking.
Oh no. So I think, yeah, that's perfect, because I think involving more stakeholders, not just the primary stakeholder, because the national government, national agencies are also stakeholders, and hitting them head on is not really productive. It's destructive. And yeah, looking at the power dynamics and ICOMOS and heritage workers can bridge that differences, because we're not part of those communities.
Yeah, that's a good insight. Yeah, there's been the nominations that have been proposed, the last two anyway, in Batanes and then in Albay, Mount Mayon, have been mainly, would you say, maybe they've been top-down processes, and they never really got any traction. Need more bottom-up, more grassroots engagement. And so, yeah, you're right. The more we can get involved. If we as practitioners want to assist communities, we can do it best by promoting a model for them to do their own, and then standing back and letting them do it. Yeah.
Can I ask? I was wondering what that model would be. As a non-archaeologist, and you folks working so closely with communities on work that is kind of abstract because it's below ground and they cannot see it, they cannot relate to it. So I was wondering what frameworks you have of narratives and how to approach the local communities, the local government, and foster an ownership eventually. I was also, well, one thing that emerged in our ICOMOS talks the other day was from some members who have worked in the fields of policy, is that it's really because heritage is not high on the list of priorities right now, and it's probably going to be relegated even lower. And many government offices who do not have heritage as their immediate mandate have other priorities and will be thinking kind of short term for the next 3 years. What's in it for me? For the best practice for heritage preservation way exceeds 3 years. I mean, 3 years is probably not even enough for community development, right? So what does that look like, and how do you get beyond that? There are some enlightened communities right now who are actually reaching out to get stuff done. Like they already have their registry of cultural properties, which maybe they've sent to the NCCA. And I would be wondering if you all had any thoughts on what are the commonalities of these enlightened LGUs and how did they get there? Because that should be included in a framework somewhere. So I guess I'm asking multiple questions. Number one, do you have a framework for community engagement and involvement? And number two, do you see any commonalities in LGUs that have this, that have owned heritage and put it in as a priority?
Yeah, I think going back to some of the radical involvements of the 60s, like CDOC, the Center for Intercultural Documentation, some other, like Saul Levinsky's Rules for Radicals, community organization tools, can be really excellent ways of looking at trying to organize or trying to help create an organization. But it also depends upon really interested and supportive local leadership. And we're kind of self-selecting for those communities in our cultural mapping, because Lila talks to the mayors and the people that are already interested. And so we already have that built in. Now, how to promote that in communities that aren't interested is going to be more problematic, maybe, to show people how those practices can benefit them. Yeah, exactly. That's probably the next step. But we're fortunate with the mayor of Burawan, for example, who just leaned over backwards to make this thing happen. He wants to see a museum, modest museum built there while he's in office, and he's been really supportive. We hope we can get back there. And it's nice thing about archaeology for some of us is our projects are in rural areas, so we can deal with social distancing once we get there, and we're not on a crowded ferry or a crowded airplane. You know, once we're in the countryside, we should be relatively safe. Those areas have been slow in the spread of the virus. Even that ought to be a model for looking at Newsom's ideas about why the Philippines resisted so many pandemics. You know, the remoteness of communities is one thing she cited, and the physical low population density. So being an archaeologist in the field is going to be really probably better for us in terms of resisting some of these things. But I don't know yet. I'm not sure what the best strategies are. Now, if the LGU can be encouraged to support the Cultural Inventory Act, I believe another part of that is that they're supposed to hire a local heritage manager. And that could be one way to help to make sure that those people who are trained in our universities, like at San Carlos and other places, that when they get their, hopefully they get a graduate degree in history or anthropology or something like that, urban planning or whatever, and that they can then go back as workers in these LGUs with the tools, with organizational tools to help promote those values within the community. So that might be one way to do it.
Thanks.
Okay. Also, if for the question of the Cortina, Dr. Grace mentioned some works, so you can, and also there's an article on the chat box. So, sorry, there was an earlier question from Ms. Tremaine. Let me just read. Hi, Dr. Peterson. Do you see significant changes in the focus or purpose of WHS in a post-COVID, especially in terms of tourism, for example? And how should LGUs and national government respond to these changes?
I do. And in fact, one of the problems may be everything has gotten so top heavy and expensive and costly that I've heard rumors that there may be a slowdown in the nominations that are even considered and in nominations that are forwarded to the committee. I hope that's not true, especially in light of the virus. I would think that probably will happen, though, just people can't get to the field. As president of ICOM, one of my responsibilities is to help on request, to help ICOMOS review nomination dossiers through our membership, through our expert members. So I get a list of the nominations coming forward each year, and then I encourage them to contact people who would have the local or regional expertise in that. So anyway, we just went through that process. There were about 9 nominations that went forward. That's at least that came through our committee. There may be more in natural areas or other areas not related to our specialty. That seems a robust number, but I was told during this process that probably we're going to see that number drop. Part of it is the sort of excessive professionalization of these dossiers. You know, it's gone a long way from a couple of pages to hundreds of pages. The most recent ones for almost any successful nomination are incredibly expensive to produce. But somehow there needs to be some sanity there, a model of a little lighter touch on this stuff. I've been impressed with the nomination dossiers, but they probably could be more, they probably could be a bit constrained. The actual ability to visit sites. So one of the things we're asked to provide is reviewers of what are called desk audits, but also site reviews. And we had to ask ourselves when in the next, the World Heritage Committee meeting is scheduled in July, right? I think Argentina and China. We haven't even heard if that meeting will go on. But for someone to do a physical site review would mean they'd have to travel to the place before then and produce their report. So this could really delay things by a year or more. We don't know when the next physical meeting. I mean, you could hold a World Heritage Committee meeting, I suppose, virtually, but people have to do these site visits to get actual, to make observations on the effectiveness of the nomination dossiers. Don't know, big question. I think it's going to slow down because of those reasons that I just mentioned. So tourism, yeah, by the same token, there's already been a pushback. And although it's considered an economic engine, it's often not necessarily for the community. It's often outside owners who actually own the, like the vending stalls, for example, at Angkor Wat. A small number of people, and then the vendors work there on lease arrangements or whatever. The vast amount of money from tourism coming to those communities doesn't always necessarily, in fact, seldom probably benefits the actual engaged community. So what's the point of it? Okay, well, the big shots, the bureaucrats, the national level and the provincial level people will see that as a benefit because there's more of an economic inflow, but it may be also destructive. Angkor Wat was almost loved to death, and now they have to really make some strictures on it. Other places, likewise. Some of the national parks in the U.S., they've actually had to do lotteries for appointments to visit them, like Yosemite and others. Remengesau, like I said, in Palau, saw the danger to the sites was far more important than the revenue, and it was a significant amount of revenue. So they're tough decisions to make. How do you keep funding the thing if you don't rely on that? There could be virtual products. I think we talked about that in the ICOMOS meeting the other day, that there could be, you could make virtual ways to tour sites. We have great 3D imagery now, for example, and drone imagery and so forth that could help. Maybe there could be a revenue stream from some of that if there's one needed. But tourism, I think, is going to have to be really seriously faced as a global problem, not just for World Heritage, but for climate change.
Okay, there's a question from Dr. Covado again. So, whose heritage should we favor, or whose rights, descendant communities or global?
Well, obvious answer would be the descendant communities. Pohnpei is another good example of this. So one of the other issues that were in the problems I saw with management was the governance model. And in Paris, and I say that just generally, I mean, people aren't all in Paris, but in Paris, they just don't understand traditional governance. I mean, there's no model for them. In Pohnpei, there's a national president, there's a regional governor, there are community leaders, but there are also 5 traditional paramount chieftaincies, chiefdoms around Pohnpei. And the chief, the paramount chief of the area of Madrilenum, which is the area that Nan Madol is in, is actually the highest of the paramount chiefs. And it's a very, it's strictly, the protocols are extremely strict. They have their own chiefly languages. And people that go before the Nanwarki, as he's called, have to behave in certain ways, and they cannot talk in English, which the Nanwarki understands quite well, but they have to speak through an interlocutor who speaks in the chiefly language, for example. It's very ritualized. They generally will do a sakau. If you're favored, there'll be a sakau ceremony and so forth. But in Pohnpei, the Nanwarki would have ultimate control over Nan Madol. And the globalists, the international experts were saying, well, that's ridiculous. You've got some guy out in a little village who's going to, have all the ultimate decision-making over this thing. You can't do that. But in Pohnpei, not only is the Nanwarki actually traditionally in charge, but he also is probably very interconnected with all of the other leadership. Like, for example, the president and the governor, who are probably somehow related through this incredibly complex array of various power relations, traditional power relations. as well as the federal and state ones. So it's really complicated. And in response to that, the legislature is producing a bill that will put the Namwarki at the head of a trust, that there are some modest veto powers from the federal and state level managers. That probably is effective, and I think the Namwarki is supportive of that in that dilemma. But that was like I said, the ICOMOS was bound to determine that the decision making had to be from a global perspective. They were very resistant, Boboy, about the Namwarki being given leadership, and I suppose that same thing might be true of power relations there in Ifugao, right? Okay.
Okay. Okay. If Are there any questions or some more insights? Okay. There's a question.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. And it won't. It will ultimately always be political. But I think, the possibility of bringing them more into maybe a sort of a national relationship, a relationship encouraging how do you deal with personality changes? How do you deal with personality changes in LGU administrative positions? Can heritage remain apolitical? Okay. There will be personality changes, and some mayors are going to be completely indifferent or maybe even antagonistic. There was a mayor of Boho'on, for example, who had made a major excavation for, I don't know what the reasons exactly were, but at the edge of the Ilihan in Boho'on that has really disfigured the landscape. Now, whether it still could be included in the Baroque church is not clear, but maybe it can be tempered. But anyway, the mayor made this decision because, I don't know, I heard all kinds of stories about how maybe a cousin was a contractor or something, who knows. But the fact is, they did this sort of arbitrarily. They weren't really in the loop on the preservation for the community and the relation to eligibility for the national or the World Heritage List. I think if there's a better relationship at the national level with promoting and supporting these heritage practices and programs in the LGUs, that could help. And then possibly even if these individuals who are named as cultural heritage managers that have to be hired, that should be hired, maybe they could have regular support on federal levels. That would encourage the National Museum. ICOMOS could be a host workshops for LGUs. I think ultimately, if the mayor comes in that's antithetical to it, the heritage manager is probably not going to be able to stop it because the voters voted this person in, but maybe that could be a way to temper it, get some outside support from ICOMOS, NCCA, National Museum, NHC, etc. It's going to happen.
And can I add?
Yes.
To borrow the phrase from Randy Maguire, heritage is a political action. It's a form of social justice and empowering descendant communities.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Randy.
Sorry, I have a follow-up with the. Hello.
We can hear.
Hello. Okay. I have a follow-up with the earlier questions asked. I guess because in the local setups, most of the heritage work is assigned to the tourism offices or something to this. So, do you think that it's also a time to have a heritage office, a separate office, and we start professionalizing our heritage workers, that you give them government plantilla and something like that, sir?
Yeah, I do. And I also think the universities can play a role, like Partido State, Bicol State, San Carlos, UP Dillman. There could be actually heritage management is already sort of addressed in some of these programs, but it could be. In fact, there is a market for it in the fact that, and I think Lila Labajo recognized this, that the fact there has to be a heritage manager hired in every LPU is a market for grad students at USC in history, which she has done really well with. So there's the universities at a national level, a national museum, NCCA, NHC could possibly develop something, but we could also in ICOMS. At least workshops occasionally, not necessarily ongoing programs.
Dr. Grace actually mentioned that on the National Heritage Act of 2008, the goal is to have resident archaeologists in LGUs. So I guess more implementation on that law
Maybe
is
that's that
necessary.
position. Maybe the
Si
same as
Buboy yun. Earl, that was Buboy, not me. No,
Sorry po.
I said the goal, personally, the goal is to have resident archaeologists
Okay.
in municipalities in the future. And then Buboy mentioned that it's on the national heritage. I don't know which one is he referring to.
Sorry, it's hard to operate on phone.
Oh, you're on the phone.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
because
the heritage manager could also have some archaeological training. That could be another component of the heritage manager's position.
okay. Are there any follow-ups or more insights from our participants? Maybe any last words or okay. So I guess we're good. On behalf of the
Earl, sorry,
sorry,
one last.
ma'am.
Well, I'm
Yes,
writing it down.
Ma'am. Okay.
Oh,
I'm just saying, hi, John. So
hi, great.
without field work in, let's say, minimum in the next 2 years, so do you think we should focus our energies on policy making?
Well, yeah, and maybe getting the word out, because this bill's been around for 10 years or more, and it's implementing regulations, I think, for 2009, so a bit over 10 years. They're pretty progressive. I don't know how to do that. I don't have any access to those political levels in the Philippines, but maybe some of the organizations do. Maybe ICOMOS or others could help help promulgate those and inform people. We can try to do more media stuff, maybe promoting some of these programs like Borao and the community cultural inventory and development and so forth. Maybe find some friendly media people in the media that could help promote that. The market for training these workers is huge as long as people actually start following it. So that there could maybe, we've talked, Grace, a couple of times about maybe San Carlos students could go to ASP for a semester or two or something and to get fundamental archaeological skills. Maybe the manager's certification qualifications could include a kind of an exposure or immersion in archaeology as well. But I think the policymakers are going to have to, that's something we can look at in indirect ways, but personally, I think as teachers, I think we can have probably more, and researchers, maybe more impact on the students and the communities.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Okay. If wala na pong tanong, I guess we can end this lecture this morning. It's actually noon, about 12. So on behalf of the organizing committee, on behalf of the organizing committee of the Partido State University and our guest panelists this morning, uh, just mabalus po, Dr. John Peterson for sharing your insights and for touring us on the heritage during this COVID-19. So thank you so much, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you. I can prepare for anybody that's interested in publications and educational materials. Just email me. I don't know if I can send it through Earl John perhaps, but I'd be happy to provide some suggestions. So send me an email, or I can send a list perhaps to Earl John. Either way, thank you all.
We'll post the recording at the museum page, and you can just, I guess, comment or message the museum if you have if you need the requirement some sources from Dr. John Peterson. So thank you so much, everyone. Happy lunch.
Bye bye.